you can sit wherever you want, I guess. Thank you for joining us. Yeah, the price of peace, rethinking security of Germany and Europe. We already heard this introduction here. Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed everything. Ended the post-Cold War area and our notion of having overcome war in Europe. German government changed its policies, creating expectation in whole Europe. And the world, the New York Times, is watching on what's happening and how united Europe will be. What are the lessons we learned? Which price are we prepared to pay for living in peace? We already heard Minister Pabriks saying security is fragile. How will we react? And I'm very grateful to discuss this with my guest here on the panel. I will start on the left with Arancha González. She's former Minister of Foreign Affairs, now Dean of the Affairs of Spain, of course, now Dean of the Paris School of International Affairs. Thank you very much for being here. Yes. We have from Ukraine, Iuliia Osmolovska, Executive Director and member of the board of the Eastern Europe Security Institute in Kyiv. We have from Norway, Eriksen Søreide, from the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and Defense and former Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway. And we have the Minister of Defense of the Republic of Latvia, Letland, Artis, Pabriks. Thank you very much for being here. And before we start the discussion, we would like to have some statements in the beginning so you can make your points straight away. And we will start with our Ukrainian guest, Iuliia Osmolovska.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, distinguished audience. And let me give my kind words of appreciation to Körber-Stiftung for the given opportunity to speak to you and to address to you today. And definitely it would be very very valuable, actually, to reflect to some of the remarks that the distinguished ministers made in the introductory speech, because Ukraine has a lot to say on that issue, and really will be very glad then to continue in discussions. But first of all, getting back to the issue of Zeitenwende, definitely, as a former diplomat, I see these titanic changes that are happening right now in the EU on the European level and within Germany itself, with regard to the support of Ukraine. And a quintessence for me in this regard was the joint communique of the G7, which actually is currently chaired by Germany. And the Federal Chancellor Scholz was the first one who called our president after these desperate attacks that Russians launched on Kyiv on 10th of October. And then this statement, G7 statement, was extremely strong in sentence. So in my all years of diplomatic experience, I haven't experienced this kind of strong language being expressed by the European leaders. So definitely we acknowledge this very much, especially those who are involved in politics or diplomatic staff or experts level. We do understand and appreciate it, but probably not on the level of the general audience, the Ukrainian public. So definitely we welcomed the recent decision of Germany to provide Ukraine with this RST system. But the general expectations of Ukraine are still, we want to see the Western partners more actively involved in supporting Ukraine. So definitely getting back, we see this Zeitenwende. And it's very symbolic that we'll be talking about NATO approach, a changed vision. It's very symbolic that right now the exercises on nuclear deterrence are happening within NATO countries. And also, all these decisions with weaponry, they are quite welcomed. But I think that these changes in perception of threats, the level of engagement of European and NATO members and supporting Ukraine should be actually matching the dynamic and intensity of the conflict as such, because we are currently not in local regional conflicts of low intensity. It's high intensity war. This is why we spend a lot of munition every day. This is why it's very difficult for West to respond adequately with the speed of that. So it means that I was a bit frustrated with the recent findings of the Kyiv Institute of World Economy, who actually does a very sorrowful survey of what had been promised to Ukraine, what Ukraine asked for, and what had been actually delivered. So there were one study in August, the other one was in October, and the dynamic of narrowing this gap of what had been promised and delivered is not there. So this is very sad to see. And especially on the stuff that Ukrainian asked about heavy weaponry, like tanks, howitzers, and MLRS system. The ratio the Kyiv University gives us is 10% of NATO stock available, actually, not 10, sorry, 2% of actually available stock of NATO countries that were provided to Ukraine, 4% for howitzers, and 3% of a MLRS system. So this is a very disappointing amount. I do understand that we could either look into whether it's political challenges and complications for that. From the words of the German minister, we saw that this is not the case. So then we need to look into whether it's probably physical incapacity to deliver somehow. Or third reason might be bureaucratic challenges to provide with swift delivery. So the call is here, why Ukraine is so energetically ask the West to keep up the pace. Because with the Globsec Security Institute, we've conducted a study on different scenarios, how the situation might develop till the end of 2023. And actually, the key factor which determined the dynamic of the situation will be the performance of Ukraine on the battlefield. But this is closely linked not just to military support of the European and Western partners in general, but also to the macro-financial stability support, which you actually provide at amazing generosity. So because of that, we are able to sustain economically right now what's happening in Ukraine. But definitely in our common interest to have this war finished as soon as possible. And Ukraine have all these military capabilities to do this in terms of trained personnel which is being trained right now in Western countries also, filling out these ranks. But also we need this kind of speedy delivery of weapons, because in this case we could defeat Russia in the very near future, and this would be resource consuming, actually, not resource consuming, it will be resource saving, and it won't lead to European fatigue of European population with regard to the war. We do understand that your public has a sort of detachment from the problem, and we don't understand why it's happening, because your politicians, they do understand all these risks, but on the level of general public, believe me, from personal experience, when we heard this Georgian war, we were sympathetic to Georgians, but we haven't understood actually what it was all about unless we saw these missiles just pouring on the streets in Kyiv and exploding. So this is why it's rather theoretical perception here about the war in Ukraine. But on the level of politicians, it's very appreciated, it's very acknowledged by Ukrainians, and we would like also to close this gap with the public. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Pabriks, what is the Latvian point of view of all this?
Well, I don't know what is a Latvian point of view, but I can definitely say my. And, you know, I have been, in the last half a year, quite critical of German policies. I must say in the last weeks I have been softening myself a little bit regarding this. But to start with trying to answer your, I would say, philosophical question, what price are we ready to pay for the peace? I would rather redirect this question. What price are we ready to pay for our freedom? That is a highly important question, because if we do remember, our ancestors and, for instance, the Second World War, it was not just a price for peace. It was a price for something which was taken away from us. And I think I very much agree, of course, what my colleague Reinsel was telling in the previous speech. But if we are looking to what is happening with our societies during the Russian attack on Ukraine, the Russian war against Ukraine, we must see, first of all, how we have been progressing within the last 7 months, what have been our mistakes before the 24th of February, and where are we going, and what will happen with us as a Western nations, as European Union, as a NATO, and also, of course, our relationship with Russia. If I'm looking to the situation before the 24th of February, I would say it was a huge blindness in the Western societies. And if you ask me a Latvian perspective, I would say that we have been frequently charged with assessments that, you know, those troublemakers at the Baltic Sea, they are telling about the Russians the bad stuff, and because the life has changed and life is beautiful and everywhere is at peace. And unfortunately, we have been right, because the West does not take into account anything what happened in Russia in 2008 with attack to Georgia, 2014 attack on Crimea, and later on with Donbass and etc. And once we had these famous quotes and sentences in the Western society about let's not escalate, then the only thing what escalated was actually the weakness. Because what escalates in Russian eyes is the weakness of the West. And we have been producing a weakness during the decades, and which made Putin and Russians to think in a false perspective that if they press more, we will simply step back. And now we are standing with our back to the wall, and we have nowhere to go back anymore. We have been making the same mistakes also after the night of 24th of February, because remember those debates, what happened in the first days. There have been a number of people telling, look, you know, Ukraine, including even German generals, telling, okay, Ukraine will lose in a few days and we will be back in a state before and we have to readjust. We had these enormous phone calls which made, as you ask, Latvian position and opinion to Moscow, phone calls from Germany, phone calls from France, trying to accommodate, trying to find a compromise. Compromise with your freedom or compromise with your consciousness? Or what type of compromise? Or compromise on the, let's say, expense of poor Ukrainians, which are now dying while we are talking. Now, if you look to the Latvian perspective, we have been managing to send the stocks of our Stingers day before the Russian attack on 24th of February, and our Latvian Stingers actually assisted that Hostomel airport was not taken by Russian paratroopers because our Stingers killed them. And that was a positive deliverance. But remember the discussions just after the 24th of February, telling that should we provide Ukraine with offensive weapons? I personally, as a Minister of Defense and Vice Prime Minister, I would say I actually don't understand this discussion about offensive and defensive weapons, which were within the first months. I mean, what is offensive and what is defensive? Every weapon is killing in the hands of a soldier or a killer. Now, and then, if you do not give, for instance, weapons which can reach a Russian territory, so what happens if Ukrainians approach the border with Russia? Will you take away their handguns because they can shoot across the border? I mean, this was a totally insane discussion which actually produced the situation where the deliveries of weapons to Ukraine actually was happening too slow, too weak, and if we would give at the very beginning or before the war that assistance what Ukraine needed, a military assistance, humanitarian assistance, economic assistance, that war would be over. We would have to pay already much smaller price for freedom, or if you wish to, for peace. Now, if we speak about contributions, of course, Minister Reinzel was very much prizing the German deliveries of air defense systems and others. And I was yesterday looking actually to the German deliveries. So as far as official sources claim, military deliveries, I don't speak about humanitarian part, because we are all part of that. But up to now, seems like Germans were delivering 30 Gepard systems, about 53 M113 military vehicles, then some 10 or 20 howitzers, big ones, you know, 2000 and etc. Now, altogether, the German military aid to Ukraine during the war is counted approximately 800 million euros. 800 million euros. Now, remember what was told about the Afghanistan war, and just a small how to say, a sidestep or a sweetener, the Latvian military aid of my country, which is less than 2 million, was actually more than 300 million euros. So, I mean, are we doing everything? Are we paying the price for that peace or freedom, what we should pay? Now, the Russian aggressor state has a GDP of maximum 3% of the world. The Western, the free West, economic might is about 50%. So if we would put all the economic assistance behind Ukraine, which is fighting a war for us, for our freedom, for our values, which we claim always in European Union and other places, this war would be over. This war, we must understand, this war is already happening now here. We are living in the wartime economy. Now, are we ready to do this, or are we not ready to do this? Because what Russians are hoping, they're simply hoping that the Western societies has become, because of the peace and good life, so vulnerable and so without resilience that by hitting economy, by hitting our psychology, economy with gas prices and energy, psychology with threatening all the time with nuclear war, that simply we will step back and we will give up. If we do give up at this moment, then it will be the encouragement for the next war, which already will be really on the European and on the NATO soil. So actually, the question, and I will finish with this because I think we need a plausible discussion, the question is very simple. Are we ready to stand for the principle that might is not right, or we are not? Are we really just paying a lip service that we are a value system-based liberal democracy, or are we ready to defend and stand for this? And this is a question not to Ukrainians, or not to Russians, and not to us. This is actually to the West. Can we rely on each other? Can we rely on the Western principles? Because this war is changing also the internal setup of Europe. Because look, you like it or not, but actually a lot of activity and a lot of decision-making now, because of the deeds and not words, is moving now from the Western Europe and even Central Europe to the East and Northern Europe, which is Nordic countries, Baltic countries, and Poland. And if I have to say the last words about what will happen after this war, what we will win, what Ukraine will win, because there is no alternative, then believe me, the Baltic Sea area, the Northern Europe, will claim also its share in the future of shaping European Union and the future of European continent. Because we have been the ones which have been paying with everything for this war, for Ukraine to stand for. And I really believe that Ukraine will be the next EU member country, and I would say also the next NATO member country, because they paid with the blood for that. And Europe without Ukraine will not be any more Europe after this war will be won. Thank you.
Thank you. The Baltic view was very clear, always from the beginning, or before the war already. Mrs. González, you just told me before that now you're not anymore the Minister of Foreign Affairs, you're now at the academic view. You can speak more openly. So what's your point?
So not only can I speak more openly, but maybe I can take a bit of altitude and think a bit long term, because essentially what we're seeing is a change in the world that the EU has been living up until recently, with the world becoming, the EU's world becoming a more hostile place. And changing from the environment we were living before, more hostile certainly on the security side, with the return of war to our territory, the return of territorial wars, colonial wars that we thought belonged to a different century, and with the weaponization of energy, which we also thought belonged to a different century. It's also becoming hostile on the economic side. As we focus on Russia, there is also China on the other side of the world, China whose economy is moving more to the left, where state intervention is becoming greater, and where the expectations would be a slowdown in this economy that has powered a lot of the economic growth around the world. More hostile also internally in our democracies, in that our democracies are moving also to more extreme nationalist positions, something that to resolve and to decide what the EU should look like in the future matters a lot, because as we just heard from Anna-Lena Baerbock, we want to remain democracies, but a democracy that works on extreme nationalism is a bit of a difficult democracy to make work. So I think what we are facing, what the EU and what Europe beyond the EU is facing, is a fundamental choice. Do we want to follow a world that has become more hostile, or do we want to have a say in how the world looks like in the future? Do we want to remain a specific model, which is what we are, a specific model combining progress, solidarity, and democracy, or will we want to change that in the future? Now, my sense, or at least my answer, it's an academic answer, so bear with me, is that the EU should remain a global power with its own specificities, a responsible and respected global power. Now, for us to remain a responsible and respected global power, we have to make a few investments. Let me briefly outline what I see as three big investments we need to make. We need to make, and frankly, this question for Europe is the question for Germany too, because at the end of the day, Germany is the big powerhouse in the EU. So as the EU responds, Germany has to also answer part of this question. So in my view, if we want to remain a responsible and respected global power, which is what the EU is, then we have to invest more in the EU. It's not enough to invest nationally. We have to invest as EU more responsibly on security, more responsibly on defense, more responsibly on industrial capacities. Some call it a strategic autonomy. For those that don't like the term because it is charged, call it the EU being responsible for its own future. And we have to do this moving in unity, and this sometimes, as we heard, is difficult, but the value for the EU is moving together in unity, not some moving forwards and other lagging behind, but moving in unity, and that takes time and it's tough. The second, in my view, on our to-do list is for Europe, not just the EU, but for Europe to also organize itself faced with this more hostile world. We saw this in Prague recently with this European political community, and it's, in my view, an interesting way for Europe to take its responsibility. The EU is part of Europe, and we know this. Ine is here. She represents Norway in this discussion. There are countries in the EU who do not want to belong to the European Union, but still want to represent this more geopolitical Europe. Now, of course, this doesn't mean that the EU should stop its process of enlarging. There are also countries in Europe who want to be members of the European Union, including Ukraine, which means that we will have to open seriously this avenue too, as we've been doing recently. Finally, I don't believe in a world where it's the West against the rest. For the EU and for Europe to be responsible and respected, we have to engage with the rest of the world. And not just on our terms, but being also clear about the priorities, the motives, and the aspirations of other countries out there, which to me speaks for the European family also being more attentive to multilateralism. I know this is not very fashionable, but this is the beauty of being an academic, is that you can tell non-fashionable stuff in the hope that someone will pick it up. So, Antje, back to you.
Thank you. Mrs. Søreide, what are the European principles being challenged by the war at the NATO's border?
Well, I think it's, for the sake of discussion, important to remember or to try to talk about what we are up against and what we will face in the coming weeks and months. If we go back to Putin's speech in Munich in 2007, he was very clear on the fact that he saw the dissolution of the Soviet Union not only as a catastrophe, but also as a great humiliation. And that is what lies behind what is happening right now and what has been happening for the past, 14 years. And I'll get back to that very shortly. So the idea or the notion that this is all about not wanting NATO to expand or to be enlarged, this is really not the case. This is about history. This is not about NATO. And this is about a president, a totalitarian regime who is only looking backwards in history and never looking into the future, because everything is about history. And that is also why I think that the lack of Western response to the attack on Georgia in 2008 actually enabled the annexation of Crimea in 2014. And not only enabled, but the fact that we were not able to do more than, to a certain extent, sanctions after 2014, having more or less the same cooperation with Russia, with some exceptions. I mean that also enabled the attack that came, or the renewed attack that came on Ukraine on 24th of February. And I think it's important to look in parallel at what was happening in NATO and the Western world alongside these events. I remember well being a fresh defense minister in October 2013. And I was at my first NATO ministerial. There was a special guest, the Russian defense minister. And this was at a time 3 years into the strategic concept of 2010, where Russia was seen as a strategic partner in the strategic concept. There were certain NATO countries who actually meant that over time, Russia could become a NATO member because things were moving in the so-called right direction. I remember well that my next defense ministerial in the spring of 2014 took place exactly at the same time as the annexation of Crimea. And I'm telling that story just to remind ourselves how we have been dealing with Russia over time. I think we have been plagued with a lot of wishful thinking. We have been thinking that if we just engaged Russia enough, they would be like us. They wouldn't be, right. And they are not. And I think some of the lessons I learned both as a defense minister and as a foreign minister was very parallel to the story I told you about Georgia and also the annexation of Crimea. In every meeting you have with a Russian minister, you have to be very, very mindful of what is being said, and you have to answer and push back everything you disagree on. Otherwise, the Russian minister will take it as an acceptance and come back years later saying that we agreed on this, which of course you have not. The point of mentioning that is that the lack of response to Georgia in 2008 was fully understood by Russia. They took it as an acceptance of moving on. The lack of response to Crimea in 2014 was exactly the same. So Russia was thinking that they wouldn't meet any kind of tough response, and they will not stop until they are pushed back, and I think that's important to remember for everyone. And right now, Russia sees strength in brutality and destruction, and that is what is happening and taking place on the ground in Ukraine as well. So what I'm concerned about in the weeks and months that we have ahead of us is not necessarily the lack of production capacity for ammunition or assembly lines for air defense systems. It is our own ability to endure what is coming. You talked about the hybrid threats, and I fully agree. Right now, we are in a situation where Russia is, of course, employing a lot of threats that are meant to instill fear, chaos, a lot of trouble in decision-making processes. Whether or not something is below or over the threshold of Article 5, typically a sabotage of gas pipelines would be a perfect example, which of course also then took place. And usually the inferior party to a conflict use these hybrid means because they lack the decisive military means on the ground. Now the tables have turned, and the so-called strong part in a conflict is now employing the hybrid threats because they see that it is extremely effective towards our societies. And if you heard Putin the other day saying that he would again start gas supplies through the parts of Nord Stream 2 that was still operational, and he could not for his bare mind understand why Western leaders would not accept this generous offer of giving well, cheaper gas to its population. So of course this all plays into how he is now and has been for a long time played the cards of hard power, soft power. And I think that we have to speak out about what we're seeing. We have to tell our populations exactly what the aims are of using these means. We have to tell them very clearly that we will be subject to a hard winter. We will do everything we can to help and support. But in addition to continue and escalate the weapon help and the aid to Ukraine, we also have to talk about what is happening and what Putin is trying to do, because ultimately he wants to undermine the support for the sanctions, the support for Ukraine, and using energy as a weapon, using information as a weapon is probably one of the most effective tools he got in his toolbox at the moment.
Thank you very much. Now, before I open the discussion, I have one question. Minister Pabriks, you first said you've been very critical with Germany in the beginning, now a little less. What is the perception of Germany's Zeitenwende by the European allies?
Well, actually, this week is not only the famous with your conference, but also with Riga conference. And if I recall correctly, in 2010, in Riga conference, I was telling that we want a German boots on the ground. And that was a big uproar at that time of how would you imagine, you know, German boots, we will never do this, this is something horrible, the Germans and military, no, no, no. So, of course, it was even for me a little bit of surprise when your Chancellor Scholz announced this huge readiness to pay for the Bundeswehr, for the military, etc. But I still, of course, look for the reality, what Germany will be capable to deliver. Because I think the German society after the Second World War, and this is our opinion from outside, was so much pacified and seen also only as an economic power that now it's extremely difficult to grasp for large segments of German society that you have to change. We want that Germany is a military power. And I might respectfully disagree with Madame Baerbock, which I consider actually, looking from outside, as a spearhead of this Zeitenwende, because she is the one which is the most popular in the Baltic countries and in Latvia. But I would disagree that still Germans are looking to all this military security and defense part only by hindering that through the European Union. No, 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 let's be serious. European Union is a good thing, it's an important thing, but we first of all want to see what Germans can do, because once we need a military action, once we need a defense action, we cannot and we will never speak in foreseeable future about, for instance, European military. Only people who are not experts can talk about that. So that means very much will depend on the military might of your country, of Germany. And your military might, sorry, actually is not there. It's not there. It's not corresponding your economic might. We need a Germany to be a much stronger country. And then, of course, European Union can be used as a restraint for Germany, but the European Union cannot be used as an encouragement for German military. It doesn't work like that, simply.
We just heard the foreign minister of Estonia saying, have we enough changed ourselves? Did we already change ourselves?
You are on the way.
Okay, you can answer whenever, no? But I have a question here on my iPad. If you have a question, then I will follow you. Okay, I have you. But I have one which is very good here on my iPad. I say, how long will Europe's support for Ukraine last with growing popular discontent and the threat of right-wing populists winning elections again, like in Italy?
I can start. Well, that is really one of my big concerns, because when German politicians, as I've heard them over the past months, talking about the real risk of social unrest due to energy prices, interest rates, inflation, and so forth, it is, of course, something that will be just tuned up by Putin and used as a way of diminishing the support. And that is why I think, as responsible politicians, even though some of us are out of ministries and offices now, but still in politics, we have to be very open to people about what this is. And I think we have to prepare people for the fact that, for the first time, I think, in as long as anyone here can remember, this is also a crisis where we cannot simply buy ourselves out of it. I mean, the pandemic was, in a way, something we could buy ourselves out of. The only issue was to invest enough in vaccines and purchasing vaccines, and we knew that there was a silver lining. We knew that it would take some time, but we would get to the end. The fact that all of the reasons I mentioned with why Putin is showing such brutality and aggression towards Ukraine, that is not something that can be mended by economic cushions. I mean, we can help out our populations as much as we can, but in the end, this is a question of values. This is two systems colliding, and we are definitely going to have to take the fight alongside Ukraine for those values that actually forms and shapes our societies and has made us what we are.
Ms. Osmolovska, are you afraid that the longer the war will last, the less support there will be? Because, you know, there's gas prices are rising, everybody's complaining and is afraid of the bill.
Yes, we are definitely aware of this fact. And actually, when we were doing the security scenario, we've been following the changes of public opinion in European Union with regard to support Ukraine, support the sanctions. And so far it has been more or less stable, so not drastic declines in this ranging in between 60 and 80% of European population supporting actually the actions. But definitely we understand that, because I said that it's rather perceived as something very distant, theoretical. So your people are not seeing all these missiles flying over the streets and exploding in the city center. So therefore, I think that the level of tolerance to this would be decreasing over the winter. And this is why we are pressing very much that it is in common interest to finish this as soon as possible, and Ukraine is capable to do it, provided we have all the requested military equipment we wanted to, in order for this only season, winter season of 22-23 will be the most challenging one. And this is also would be very relievable to the European politicians to express to their public so that you need to stay strong, be brave as Ukraine for at least one season, so it's not going to last longer. And the longer the war goes, because there are still risks of this protracted conflict, and our General-in-Chief of the Army actually explicitly said this in his article, that there is a huge risk, and this is the high probability scenario for this war to get into a protracted one. And then all of us will be losing, because European insecurity will be fixed for indefinite time. Unless the matter is finished, you can't actually learn how to behave, how to act coexist with aggressive Russia. So we need to finish the matter first and to see a different Russia. So this is my answer. Thank you.
Okay.
Can I just, of course, it's not a question just of financing, although the financing will go a long way in ensuring that those that are at the lower level of our societies don't feel an exacerbated pain. And that needs to be resolved at the European level, because this also has to do with the energy union, and that will work if we do it at the EU level. But beyond that, there is a thing that we need to work on more for the long term, and this is making sure that all European citizens share their nightmares. Their nightmares today are different because they are shaped by their history. A person in Spain doesn't have the same nightmares that a person sitting in Estonia. And it's normal. By the way, the person in Estonia doesn't share also the sense of insecurity that someone sitting in Spain or Portugal has, which is driven by its own history, by its own geography, and that is also something we have to invest on, making sure that the European citizens share their nightmares as much as they can, because that is how you build a common sense of the threats and therefore a common sense of the responses that Europe can give to all their citizens. But at the moment, this is not the case, and we shouldn't be surprised by this.
I now open for the audience. You've been the first. Maybe you introduce yourself.
Thank you. My name is Katie Chumbadze. I'm Deputy Head of Mission of Georgia to the European Union. Georgia was a couple of times mentioned here. Indeed, in 2008, Russia's aggression in Georgia was the first test towards a resolve of the European Union and the entire West. It's indeed very that peace has its price, but we all are paying this price because we still are in the responsive mode. In 2008, we were in the responsive mode. In 2014, we were still there while Crimea was annexed. When Abkhazia and South Ossetia were occupied in 2008. And even today, we still continue to being stuck in this responsive mode. My question would be to distinguished panelists, distinguished ministers from Latvia and Norway. So how Germany and the European Union can shift this responsive mood to the proactive policy in a way that there is less price to be paid for peace? And what would be the perspective of further enlargement and Georgia's or Ukraine's membership in the European Union in that regard? Thank you.
Well, I'll try to be brief if I can. Look, of course, perception of threat is different in Western Europe or Western Europe, for instance, compared to the Baltic countries or Nordic countries, because if this perception of threat wouldn't be there, then Finland and Sweden would not exchange their traditional policy and join now NATO. But I once more would like to remind, and I think this is what we have to tell to our public and our people, yes, gas prices might rise. Yes, social life might get more difficult, but we must understand that we are living in the wartime economy, all of us. And if we are not winning this war, then the next war might be the last war for us. That we also must understand. And people must forget, okay, people can't forget about this, but people must understand that their traditional worries or economic benefits, what they are getting, must be put aside as a second priority, because the first priority is really now to prove that you can stand for these values which we were always claiming on the paper and vocally, but we were not actually never testing them. Now it's a testing time. Are we really ready for this? And once you mentioned, for instance, about this danger of right-wing populism, let's be honest. I mean, in Western Europe, it's not only right-wing populism, but also left-wing populism, which is equally dangerous if we are looking to this war situation and attitude towards Russia. Because there are left and right-wing parties actually equally supportive for some kind of consensus on not their expense with Russia just to end this. So I think there is no other way as simply to consolidate our population and tell this will not be over easy. We are with our backs at the wall. But as far as the Georgian membership in EU and further on, I think, unfortunately, it's now a different discussion, but I think that Ukraine now is much further than you are because of also certain internal discourses and political choices you have been making in Georgia, and you know what I'm talking about.
I have a question here in this row.
Thomas Leinebrockhoff with the German Marshall Fund with a question to Minister Søreide. Norway has been incredibly helpful with energy supplies to Europe in this difficult situation. It has also made enormous profits from that situation. So my question to you is, what is Norway willing to invest into eventually Ukrainian reconstruction? And a quick question to Mr. Pabriks. Now, critique of Germany's foreign policy is as justified as it has become a cottage industry and a sport. You have been a real athlete in this discipline over the past month, and you've said that you have tempered your critique. If this was a tempered critique that we have heard, I'd be very interested in what it is that you didn't say and why.
You want to answer directly?
Well, what I didn't say, you see, of course, I'm a politician, and I, in some way, I was telling also my German counterparts that don't get upset to me, because I'm simply expressing what my people think of Germany. And actually, at this moment, and I can tell this to you, at this moment, there are many analysts and general public in Latvia or in the Baltic countries very genuinely thinking, if there will be a crisis or war, can we trust Germans? That is the biggest question. Can we trust Germans? Because one thing is what Germans are telling, that we are with you and your border is our border and we will assist. But we have been asking for decades, actually, once Berlin was telling that we are there for you, how exactly will you do this? Do you have the means and do you have a political will to do this? I think, and I genuinely believe that German society is slowly changing, as far as we understand this, into the right direction. So that means the German society is finally understanding this grave responsibility of also of military necessity. But we are still far from that goal. I don't want to go into the history and etc., but I would say that the biggest importance is what we need to answer is, can we really trust the Germans? And can we get this support immediately when we will need this, and not in 5 months or 6 months? Because for us, the Russian threat, differently from you, and differently from Spain, Portugal, or France, or Italy, is of fundamental existence. This is why we are now spending for defense 3% almost. It's a plan for us. We are introducing compulsory military service. We are introducing a total defense system, because once we see what happens in Bucha, what we see what happens in Mariupol, this is nothing new for us. This is what they did to us when they occupied us after the Second World War. They were raping, they were doing all the things what you could imagine, and you were not talking as a German society here after Russian invasion in Second World War for obvious reasons. But we know what happened, and we are determined that this will never again happen on our soil, which means we must be ready to defend the first centimeter of our country, of our border. And I'm speaking here also about Estonia or Lithuania or Poland. We are not taking chances just to hear the words that we will assist you, everything will be fine, etc. No, we are not going to risk. And this is not just a words. We who experienced the Soviet regime, we who experienced the Russian invasions and abuses of our parents and grandparents, we are ready to die for our country and to die for our children. Are you ready to die? That's a question. And Germans must answer this question. Are you ready to die for freedom? We are ready to do this. And this is not words, this is serious.
This is what also Annalena Baerbock said, that she is always asked first, can we rely on you? Yeah. Mm-hmm. But the first question was for you. I didn't forget.
A bit of a steep move to energy from life and death issues, but still I'll try as best as I can to answer your question. Norway is now, of course, the most important and the biggest provider of gas to Europe. And I have to say that I think now there is a strong realization in Norway that energy policy is also security policy. That has not always been the case, because we have never used energy as a security policy tool, but others do. And that is why we have to realize that. And I remember back in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, I asked my security policy department in the defense ministry to give me an assessment of how Russia was then using energy as a tool, at that point isolated more or less to Ukraine, but turning on and off the switch. And it was a lot of enthusiasm in the defense ministry. It was not that much enthusiasm in other ministries at that time, because there was a bit of a reluctance to see this as a security policy tool. You are right that the income has, of course, increased a lot because we sell more energy, and the shortage makes the prices higher. That is not conducive to Norway either, because it makes a huge imbalance in the energy market, which, of course, is not good for anyone. And no one is served by the prices that is seen right now. And I cannot, of course, speak for the current government after the change of government, but I can say this much. So far, there has been full political, unanimous support to everything from reconstruction funds to arms donations, aside, of course, from one party in parliament, the Communist Party, who would not like to send arms and weapons, but otherwise there has been support. What the number will be in the future is, of course, very difficult for me to say, and the government will have to answer that, but I can again say that from our side, from the opposition side, there is a strong push to the government to do everything we can, both on the financial side and weapons, and also the political support that is needed. This is, of course, nothing that we can do alone, but I think it is extremely important that Norway also leads the way in having these discussions on everything from defense spending to reconstruction of Ukraine, and also what happens in 10 years' time. How can we try to assure that we will not end up in this situation again, either in Ukraine or in any other country in Europe? So that's part of the discussion, and of course the government will have to come back to the details when they have shaped them. But it is a strong political support in Norway for all kinds of support to Ukraine. My suspicion is it will last, and it will even get stronger.
So I already heard the sound, but I know there is a lot of questions. Can we have a quick one here? Very quick. Short question, short answer. So.
Sounds good. Michał Baranowski, GMF Warsaw. No observations. Question to you, Minister, and perhaps to Ms. Osmolovska. We are discussing here whether Søreide is real. What would it take in a short term, let's say the next 3-4 months that are crucial for Ukraine, for you to say Søreide is real, and for you, Minister, to say the same perhaps over a longer term? When could you trust, as you say, Germany or Germans, that they have in fact switched enough in a direction to understand the Russian threat? Thanks.
Okay, first Ukraine and second, let's say, Germany or us, yeah? Well, I think with Ukraine, probably there is very conventional answer from my side. We simply must do everything we can to provide them with everything they need, without any hindrances. Plus, of course, we have to give a clear signal to Russians, and they will see this publicly, that we will not step back. Very simple. They understand the force. They're not stupid. Yes, they have a certain problems of maneuvering themselves, you know, in their heads, but there is no other way. Ukraine must win. We must provide Ukrainians with everything they need. Simple. Everything, humanitarian, economic, and of course, definitely military, first of all. And remember winter. So Russians are hitting now infrastructure. They hope that Ukrainians will freeze. They will not freeze. They will survive. They have a motivation. As far as us in Europe and Germany, well, I think that we simply must move forward not only, and I mean, I'm a politician, I understand how these things work basically, but we must also in our minds to divide what we talk and what we really do. For instance, there are a number of things. First of all, what we have to do is to move forward as soon as possible with European Union education mission in Poland. As far as my latest information is, Germany is still blocking this because they want part of that mission to be also in Germany. I don't know why, but I think we simply must go with Polish case. Latvia is ready to participate. The next thing is about, for instance, our military stocks and military industry. Let's do step by step and do real things and not just dream about European army or something. And once I hear, for instance, about this old talks, which is long time already on the scene, about different military equipment, which should be kind of consolidated. I would say yes, but looking from my country's perspective, what we are doing now, we are developing our own military industry because we learned from the COVID crisis that we cannot rely on deliveries, we cannot rely on the global networks because simply they are not working. So we need also our military industry, for instance, ammunition, repairments, etc. If I hear some larger European countries, including Germany, telling that we will unify air defense systems, we will unify this, if that means that we would have to buy all the time everything only from Germans or French or Italians, this is not going to work. There must be also a production lines and industrial cooperation with smaller countries. And this is a totally different talk. But military industry, believe me, is the one I have been working now for 4 years, drastically. And big countries must take this into account, how we think about that. I will stop with that.
Mrs. Osmolovska, one short.
Yeah. So what is crucial for the coming 2-3 months, you can see developments on the battlefield that Ukrainian side is trying to get as much as possible to regain the control of the territory of Ukraine. And we hear some encouraging signs about Kherson and Kherson region to see these positive developments, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, or even faster, because you see how the company military campaign in Kharkiv region have developed drastically just in a couple of days. Ukrainians retook quite a big part of the territory. So positive assessments that Ukrainians, with this intense of counter-offensive, provided they have means for that, Ukrainian can regain the control of all the territories pre-24th of February, even by the end of this year, or even go further. But then we come again to these immediate needs for Ukraine. I mentioned to you this very disappointing proportion. So Ukraine asked for heavy artillery to be able to do this counteroffensive, scaled counteroffensive, entire front. And 2% of NATO tank stockpiles, 4% of NATO howitzer stockpiles, and 3% of MLRS systems. So it's a miserable amount. And when I mentioned that there is big discrepancy about what Ukraine requested, been promised, and been delivered, so still the gap is, our military people told in summer that the gap was around 10%, only 10% of Ukrainian needs were covered. Right now we're talking about roughly 30–40% of what Ukraine's requested so far, but it's still not sufficient. So therefore my plea to all of you would be to consider whether there is a room to change the dynamics of these deliveries, because it's in our common interests. We can make this war as short as possible with your assistance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry, time is over. Thank you very much for discussing with us a lot. It's not about peace, it's about freedom. You corrected me. And yeah, thank you very much for discussing, and I'm giving back for your question, giving back to Alisa the word.
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, yes, yeah. Thank you very much.